what becomes luxury at the end of the day is kind of the true question. In a safari lodge in Zambia called Puka Ridge, we designed a rooftop sleeping experience on top of the bathroom where you get to go and sleep under the stars, but you have the refuge of safety of being in this tower, in this kind of wildlife environment. Something like that is true luxury. No five-star hotel in its norm gives you that.
Before we go into the podcast, if you could just go and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to it, it makes a huge difference to the podcast, the amazing conversations we get to have, and the incredible guests we're able to get on the podcast. So it's probably not something you would think about, but if you could just go rate the show, follow it, or share an episode, it does make a huge difference to the show. Thank you so much. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. Today's guest is someone who's truly redefined what it means to be designing with both luxury and sustainability in mind. Graeme Labe is the creative genius behind Luxury Frontiers, a company that's pushing the boundaries of experiential hospitality. After years in the safari industry, his passion for designing in harmony with nature has taken him around the world, from the wilds of Botswana to the coast of Mexico and beyond. In this episode, Graeme shares some incredible stories. He talks about sleeping under the stars in Zambia, in the middle of a wildlife reserve, an experience no classical five-star hotel can match. His innovative use of materials like bamboo and timber, creating sustainable structures that blend seamlessly within nature, tackling the challenges of building in remote places, like transporting materials by boat in the Okavango Delta, or carrying supplies on donkeys, like in a project in Peru. And perhaps the most fascinating of all is his approach to biophilic design, which is connecting guests to the nature around them. Graeme's journey from living on top of a Land Rover in Botswana to working with his first client, Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, is as extraordinary as the project he leads. I can't wait for you to hear his story. Welcome, Graeme. It's a pleasure to having you here. I'd love to hear about your journey. What early experiences or influences got you interested in using alternative and sustainable construction methods?
Thank you. And I really appreciate you having me on your podcast. It's really a great honor to be here. Thank you. So how did my journey start? I originally started, coming out of the project management field, and I was working for a company. It was then called Orient Express Hotels, and I was based out of Cape Town. And this was quite some time ago. This was, it was about 1999. The company bought a whole lot of safari lodges in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. And at the time, I was one of the very few South Africans or Africans working for the company. And they thought, okay, because I'm a African or South African, I must know exactly what happens in the bush and what happens in safari. But at that time, I knew absolutely nothing. I mean, I'd been on safari and I could have been to game reserves, etc. So they packed my bags. They sent me to a place in Botswana, and Botswana is a country just north of South Africa and has quite a famous wildlife area called the Okavango Delta, which is ecologically is a really special place. That's a whole nother story. But they sent me there because they had bought a series of 8 lodges and camps that they needed somebody to go and manage the restructure, the reconstruction, and kind of creating this new product, safari product for them. So they were a traditional hotel brand who had now decided to enter into this realm of safari and wildlife tourism. And I managed to, I was really excited to go. It was going to be a great learning curve for me. And I landed up spending 5 years living in Botswana and literally living in the back of my Land Rover and going from my sites to my different sites. I used to sleep every single night on top of my Land Rover with a mosquito net and a sleeping bag. And it was probably one of the most amazing experiences of my life, kind of learning from the people around me and the people that I was working with about the safari industry, about construction and design within remote locations. And that was really, and it was just by pure luck that I landed up in this environment. And I just went kind of absolutely mad for the experience. Whilst I was there in about my 5th year, I met a gentleman by the name of Jeffrey Kent, who is quite famous in the safari industry. He founded a company called Abercrombie and Kent, and he asked me to come and join him and help him develop out his series of lodges and camps. And I kind of left what I was doing, and I decided to take on this new challenge. And I took up the role of design and development director for Abercrombie and Kent. And I was really privileged to, manage the design and the development of, I think it was about 16 properties across sub-Saharan Africa, and it even went right up into Egypt doing this. And really, really got the opportunity to look at different environments, different ecosystems, kind of really starting to understand that safari is not the same in every location, that there were contextual elements to it, that there were cultural elements to kind of every single location that you went to. And just getting that exposure and having a certain amount of kind of leeway around the design, around kind of finding solutions, again, was another kind of learning curve for me. And then what happened is in 2009, when, there was the economic crash, the company Abercrombie Kent for that time decided to halt on their development for a while. And I made a decision, a crazy decision at the time, to go and start my own design business and my design and development business. And asked at the time Abercrombie and Kent, I'm going to do this, I want to go on my own. If you have any development work, I'd appreciate the opportunity to try and get some of that work. And that was kind of my starting point. But at that time, I was finishing a lodge for Abercrombie and Kent and just doing some renovation work on a lodge near Victoria Falls, on the Zambian side of Victoria Falls. And whilst I was at the airport one day, I met a friend of mine who was a safari guide who used to guide for high-end clientele. And he told me, I've got somebody that I'd like you to meet. And he introduced me to Paul Allen, who was one of the founders of Microsoft. And I managed to get my first contract, or my first kind of job for myself, to do one of his lodges in Botswana. And I thought, the gods must be kind of looking down on me to kind of get this as your first client. And kind of that was the kind of launch of myself as myself, and kind of creating my own business, but focusing initially on the safari business, kind of purely the safari business within Africa. I did get to do some work in South America, in Chile, in the Atacama Desert, and some in Patagonia, but really, really focusing at that time on safari lodges and camps. I met my current business partner, Luca Franco, and we had this idea of taking the idea of design and experiential hospitality to a wider kind of spectrum throughout the Americas and Europe. And we formed a company called Luxury Frontiers. And that is where I am today. So that is a very quick synopsis of kind of where I started to and kind of where I am today.
That's an amazing story. And that's the story of how Luxury Frontiers came to life. That's really impressive.
Yeah, that is my story to Luxury Frontiers and kind of my journey within Luxury Frontiers. And I think what we've kind of tried to do now as a design firm and studio is we see ourselves as a multifaceted design firm, is that we have all the design elements within our firm, but we also have a hospitality advisory section as well, which advises potential investors, advisors, operators who want to enter into the experiential hospitality field. But as a design studio, which I head up, is our real main focus is for the hospitality industry and what we call the experiential hospitality industry, is that we provide architectural and design services, but focusing on, of course, sustainability, which is one of our core pillars, but also designing the experience and also designing using alternative materials. So our go-to is not brick and mortar. Our go-to is anything but brick and mortar. So that, kind of brick and mortar is the exception rather than the rule for us.
I really want to go deeper into a lot of things that you just mentioned, like contextual elements, culture, construction elements, building in remote places, the missing infrastructure, and all of that. But before we go deeper into that, for all our architects and designers out there listening to us, can you define what makes a hospitality project more of a experimental hospitality project, especially like in the luxury segment you're moving in?
The reason that, these projects, let's say, are where they are and kind of what is going to deem the success of the project is really about the location. And the location is about what one experiences in that location. That could be, when you're going into a safari experience, it's really about the wildlife and the safari experience. And that is primary. If it is in somewhere like a place of immense beauty like Patagonia or the Azores, it's really about the place, and it's really about one thing: nature, and being surrounded by nature and being immersed by nature. And that is the key to what this experiential hospitality is really about. And then there are all the kind of various plug-ons to that as well. I mean, those could be kind of cultural, they could be social, and you have those kind of plug-ons. And what this does is, because of these locations, a good percentage of the time, they are very remote and they come with their kind of own challenges. But that is part of this experience.
So then from a design perspective, how do you make sure your projects blend in perfectly with their natural surroundings and that they aren't invasive? Like, can you share a project where this approach was particularly challenging, but it turned out really well?
We like to think that all our projects are challenging, because that is where our kind of speciality is. And I think if that is, that is the challenge to these kind of projects, is that your first step is to be respectful. And whatever, whatever you do to be respectful, your first step is to look and listen and to understand. And it's a buzzword to be contextual. I think most architecture, unless it's really brutalist, is about contextual architecture. And, there needs to be contextual in different ways. But when you want to look at these kind of challenges, is that you're doing this not because you want to create a statement within the architecture. You actually want to do something that is a different kind of statement, a statement of place, a statement of blending in. And in order to achieve this from an architectural and a design point of view, one of our key principles within our design is using design principles such as biophilic design. And for us, that is a really, really key driver within our design process. And there are just so many factors to that. And the reason that we look at this is that when we design for the guests or for the hotels or for the resorts or for the lodges and camps that are coming to experience this location, they are coming to experience nature. And you can't experience nature by building walls around you to protect yourself from that nature. You need to kind of open yourself up to the nature itself. And that's what biophilic design is really kind of telling you to do. It does tell you within biophilic design how important refuge is, but finding that balance between what they call in biophilic design peril and refuge is a very, very important balance to get in this type of design.
Tell me more about biophilic design. Like, for those listeners who are not familiar with biophilic design, what are like the key principles that you consider?
I think to understand kind of where biophilic design stems from is the kind of term biophilic design, I think, came about in about 1964, and it's really based on humans really intent and need to connect with nature. And these then kind of lead to certain kind of principles. And it's only in the last between 20 and 10 years that has really come to the foreground. We went through, for many years, we went through a stage where architecture was protecting you from the elements as opposed to connecting you to the elements. So I think the principles about connecting you to the elements are really important in this, and the kind of that need to connect you to nature. And it connects you most probably in kind of three main ways. One is, directly. It connects you, when we say directly, it connects you directly in terms of making sure that your views and your space is open to nature. It is important that passive cooling is included within your design. You want to touch and feel nature, and you need to bring nature in, and you need to bring the experience out. And it's one of those principles to design. A lot of kind of design is designed from outside in. And I think this kind of reverses it. And you design from inside out, but bringing that inside in. And I think these are kind of some of the, these are kind of really some of the key principles to it. The other ones are the indirect principles. And those are the things that are physical, but not directly something like fire or water or airflow. but they are things that are taken from nature. That would be the materials that you use, using natural materials, using patterns from nature. So those patterns could be something like patterns of biomimicry or biomimic patterns, meaning that you would use within your design the scale that you try and represent forms of nature, something like the scales of a fish come into your design. And it's things that become textural that then become direct. It's not just using natural elements, but natural elements that have patina. So meaning that it's in nature, things naturally decay, things naturally create real textures, and not textures that are hard and glossy, and it's really about bringing those natural forms and patterns in. And then it's really about kind of forms and places, and that is where you bring in your elements of refuge, peril, and also trying to kind of understand about what is around the next corner and surprise. And it's about not designing necessarily with straight lines, using kind of curvature, using natural forms and kind of natural paths that you would take within nature. And I think taking those principles into place are the real drivers for your biophilic design.
That's beautiful. So I'm really intrigued by your use of alternative or natural materials. What are some of these materials with texture and or also these materials that have that add a natural patina that have helped you keep the carbon footprint low? And are there some innovations in material use that you're particularly looking forward to?
In terms of this, in terms of kind of natural based materials that we love using timber. And it's not the easiest material to work with, because there is the perception of what it looks like and how it ages. But timber is really one of the most beautiful elements to work with. The other is we do quite a few bamboo structures, and bamboo in terms of its form, it just allows you to create the most beautiful angles and forms. And when you do that, these forms start to look like forms coming out of nature. They start to mimic animals. And a really good example of where we've achieved this so well is we did a project in Mexico for 4 seasons. It's called Naviva. It's on the Pacific Ocean. And we used a lot of bamboo on this. And we did use some membranes as well. But the designs were really all based around these biophilic principles. But the biomimicry forms that we were able to achieve is we designed a particular building, which is the arrival building. So we didn't want to, coming back to the element of designing experiences, we wanted this, and together with the operator, we wanted to design a hotel that broke the norms of normal hospitality. So we didn't want to have the reception like everybody has a reception, and there's a receptionist behind the desk, and it creates barriers, because biophilic design breaks down barriers and opens things up. And we wanted the experience, not just the architectural experience, but all the experiences to be open and flowing. So we designed this arrival pavilion that replaces a normal reception. And we did it across a bridge, which was really about representing moving from one space to another, meaning the world outside of the resort into the resort. And we built it as a tunnel and a pod. And it really was the representation was really a worm moving into its cocoon. And the whole idea was that you moved like the worm into the cocoon. And the idea that sounds a bit corny is you come out the other side kind of feeling like a butterfly. And kind of that is a representation to the building, but the way it was, we were able to translate it in the architecture using bamboo and copper. It was really, kind of something that we were really proud of in terms of really adhering to our design beliefs.
That's beautiful. We talked about it before. So you really balance sustainability and luxury in your projects. How do you do that? And how would you define luxury in hospitality?
As I said in the kind of, as we started this part of the conversation, is that whilst people want to experience and have a hotel experience, that in the kind of properties that we design and do the developments for, it's really about the ability to connect with nature. And in order to do that, sometimes less is more. And for us, that is kind of really, really important. And what becomes luxury at the end of the day is kind of the true question, is that I'll give you some examples, is in a safari lodge in Zambia called Puka Ridge, we designed a rooftop sleeping experience on top of the bathroom where you get to go and sleep under the stars, but you have the refuge of safety of being in this tower, in this kind of wildlife environment. And something like that is true luxury, is to have the opportunity to go in a safe environment, which is your refuge and in terms of biophilic design, and sleep under the stars. I mean, that's no 5-star hotel kind of in its norm gives you that. They might put a skylight above your bed, but to really truly sleep under the stars, for me, that is luxury. And that stems back to my early days of sleeping on top of my Land Rover and getting that kind of experience, but being able to kind of translate it into a kind of a luxurious experience is kind of, for me, the definition of luxury. The kind of same thing is that we just completed a lodge in South Africa called Madweleni River Lodge. And we've done the most beautiful outdoor dining restaurant. And, just having that ability to kind of dine under the stars, like truly dine under the stars, not dine outside on a patio or a deck next to a restaurant, but this structure that we designed, and it's got such a deep backstory to it. It's designed that you actually cannot just walk from the lodge or the camp into this building. You actually have to be driven to it, and it's out in the middle of the bush. So it's got no light pollution around it. You just walk in and it's lit with paraffin lamps and candles, that the play of light from the stars, the play of light through the structure, it just gives you the luxury of that experience in terms of connecting with nature, but in using the architecture to help you do that.
So it's completely dark outside and you wouldn't even see like a lion approach or something like that.
Well, you wouldn't see a lion approach, but you're lucky you're in this, they call it a boma, you're in this kind of fenced in area. I mean, if the lion wants to walk through the entrance, it could, but it's just being completely out in nature and kind of being immersed in nature. And it just gives you that connection. And that's, I'm kind of keep on coming back to the principles of biophilic design. Not everybody wants to go, and they may think they want to go and sleep on the top of their Land Rover but they still want to be able to go to, they still want to have a proper shower, and they still want to go to the bathroom, and they still want to do this, and they still want a beautiful meal served to them. So it's about encompassing all of this into luxury.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you, with your projects, you really managed to challenge the traditional notions of luxury hospitality.
Absolutely. And, whilst I say that the architecture and the design is not the driver, it helps to curate the experience and enhance the experience. So we're there, our designs are there to kind of elevate the experience, I would say. It's making sure that that experience in talking about the materials are not materials that you would live with in your every single day of life. Nobody, 99.9% of us don't live in a home that is made from rammed earth walls, for instance. Beautifully done. A lot of people around the world do live in adobe homes, but a lot of tourists have never lived that experience, but experienced it in a luxurious way.
If you're enjoying the show, I have a small favor to ask that would mean the world to me. By rating and sharing the podcast, you're helping us grow and spreading our mission of making sustainability really desirable and cool to a wider audience. Besides of that, imagine impressing your colleagues with the latest insights on sustainable architecture. So make sure you follow the podcast and become the most informed in the room. Thank you so much for your support. Talking about these natural materials again, how do you make sure your projects use locally sourced materials? Or do you think it's possible to achieve luxury hospitality without relying on imported materials at all?
I think everything is a bit of give and take. And so I can give you the flip side to that, is yes, there is a big school of thought to say, yes, let's use vernacular architecture and vernacular building materials. But from a sustainable perspective, there is another school of thought that says, let's be as light on earth as possible. And let us use materials and kind of materials that are already thought through and that can be projected in a really beautiful way, but are done in a prefabricated form, ensuring that as little damage to the environment is achieved. And I think that has its place as much as using materials from that local environment. And I'll give you some examples of this. Is we do a lot of work in national parks around the world and in Africa. And one of the, especially in places like the Okavango Delta, which is a very, very fragile environment, is they don't want you to put foundations in. They don't want you to, in fact, you're not allowed to put foundations in. You're not even allowed to put concrete footings in place. And you've got to find solutions to your design to give the level of luxury in terms of our business, but also get over those challenges, of not being able to put a foundation in and putting floating platforms in, and then bringing in materials to kind of work with that And the other thing in those designs, there is a requirement that those buildings within a period of time need to be dismantled and removed from the site, that you actually have to bring the site back to its natural form. And that in itself comes with its own challenges. At every point, there are it's like life. Life pushes and pulls you as you go along. And design in this environment pushes and pulls you and challenges as you go along. And that's what makes it so exciting, is to kind of innovate for those challenges.
Tell me more about designing in remote places. Like, it must come with a lot of challenges. And how do you tackle issues like accessibility during the construction phase, but also later for the customers, and infrastructure such as waste management, while keeping things sustainable?
Our starting point on a project like these, kind of these remote off-grid projects, is our starting point in our design process is not necessarily in the architectural design in itself. It's our first thing that we design for the project is a environmental framework that we are going to work towards. So we make sure that we align with our clients' needs, we align with what the regulations are, and what we try and do is we try and move and almost direct our clients along the principles that we believe are the most sustainable. Sometimes, but not always, are clients prepared to benchmark this with something like a LEED platinum certification, but we then create this framework that we want to work in. We then look at kind of assessing the design overall, not only from, as I say, the architecture, but the architecture of the infrastructure. And that is really key to us. So we have to work, a lot of design happens where you kind of design, and then at the next stage, you'll bring in your MEP consultants or your electrical consultants. We work on those concepts ourselves from day one. We always figure out water, power, sewage, solid waste. And when we were thinking about all of these things, we were thinking ahead, how is this going to operate, or how should it operate? So, for instance, you're going to install a sewage treatment plant. You've got to make sure that when you are doing this, that you're planning ahead with the operator, that they are using the right kind of chemicals that are going to work with this sewage treatment plant. Because you can't put in something that is going to fail at a later stage. So we look at, first and foremost, looking at the kind of infrastructure that we need to put in place. Is it going to be photovoltaic from an electrical point of view? Is it going to be hydro? Is it going to be wind? And we always take that very much into account. And then we start moving into the, kind of once we've done our context studies and we've got our design narrative, we then start designing everything according to how our infrastructure is going to kind of work, and making sure that we design, this is mainly around kind of our power requirements, around kind of power management and where we can use natural light, where we can use passive cooling as opposed to electrical cooling. And that is really, really important from day one, is how does that affect your architecture? Because your architecture and your infrastructure have to align, because, there's not just a plug or a cable that comes in from the street and you kind of plug it in. You've got to consider things like, am I going to have what water capacity do I have for this particular location? Is water a rare resource or abundant resource in this location? Do I need to kind of design my toilets on a closed loop system? Do I make a decision to have baths or just showers? You know? So it's all of these kind of things that will, both the infrastructure and the design always go hand in hand in terms of the sustainability.
That's extremely interesting that you really think through the whole process. What's like the craziest place you've built a project in terms of infrastructure?
For us, one of the kind of biggest challenges is kind of for us to date have been most probably islands in the places like the Bahamas, and even in the Okavango Delta is one of, for us, the most challenging places to build, because what happens is that some of the properties that we've done in the Okavango Delta are on islands. You know, you can truck your materials to a certain point, and then they need to be put onto a boat, and then they need to be kind of literally ported to site. Okay. So those are the considerations. And I'll give you another example. We're busy working on a project in Peru at the moment. And the whole idea of this project is that you hike from one lodge to the next. You cannot drive. There's no way that a vehicle doesn't go from one property to the next. So the consideration of the design that everything has to be carried in on donkeys and mules. So you need to make sure that like everything that you design, can only be a certain length. The part of it has to be made in this modular form that it can be put together, because you can't take something more than 3 meters. We can't transport anything longer than 3 meters to site. So those are the things that you need to consider in your design. So the design is not, in these kind of remote locations, doesn't just take the kind of aesthetic design into account. It takes the logistics. It takes the infrastructure. It's all these layers that you really need to think about in your design when you're designing on these remote locations. And, that's why I talk about vernacular architecture versus modular architecture, and they, in sustainable design, they both have their place.
Yeah, the donkey sounds fun if you think about it from an experience of the traveler that gets there with maybe a backpack and the donkey, but not if you think about the people that have to bring the waste back from or away from the hotel.
Yeah.
Or the construction side.
Exactly. And that's why kind of modular architecture is such an important place, because it cuts down on all of that, and it's all of these kind of elements of the design and that are so important, and the thought to it. And whilst we may be only designing a property or a lodge or a camp that is only 10 rooms, for instance, it takes us a long time to design this, because the thought of the detailing, not just the thought of the kind of finishes and the detailing of like those kind of touch and feel finishes, but you're thinking about the infrastructure. You're thinking about, okay, I can only have so many, because I can only have so much power. I can only have so many kind of lights and so many outlets, and you've got to be thinking about, how do you kind of design your kitchen, and how do you design your kitchen experience, because you can't necessarily take a oven and a stove in unless you actually dismantle that stove and take it into the site. So just the layers of thinking that one has to go through to kind of design and make sure that these properties can be developed. I'm talking about the extreme, but they all have levels of complexity.
And how do you make sure, for example, if you talk about modularity and breaking things down to a point where they fit in on a donkey or on a boat or whatever, especially if you work on islands, whether just like bringing it in as a whole with a plane or something like that?
Again, everything has its kind of challenges, and you've got to kind of design to it. But you know, we there are where I think materials are going today is I think they are kind of uh, really two really good materials for the future. One is mass timber, and I think the ability to kind of design using it and construct using it is phenomenal. It has structural strength to it. It has phenomenal insulation properties, and it looks good, and it is a sustainable product. So for us, kind of products like that are really important. Um, Glue beams are also another phenomenal, GLT and glue beams are another phenomenal material to use kind of in timber for these kind of environments that we do it, is that they are aesthetically really beautiful pieces of material to use, and they can, the kind of architectural forms that you can use, that you can achieve to do this, is also an amazing kind of way to build. We in our studio we use a lot of canvas and membrane materials. We do a lot of tented camps, and that is another kind of form to do that. And that's actually kind of the base of where we started, is kind of doing tented camps and doing a lot of canvas and membrane architecture, and we've been able to kind of design world-class resorts using membrane and tented architecture. And for example, there is most probably one of the most famous hotels in the United States called Amangiri in Utah. It's near Lake Powell, and on the same property we did a tented camp for a month, and it is just from a experience point of view, from an architectural point of view, and from a public demand point of view, it has just been an absolute success. So something like that, and that is really all done in modular architecture.
That reminded me, you mentioned before that you had once a project where you weren't allowed to build foundations. How did you solve that constructively?
So we often do that, and kind of often find this as comes across our path. There are different ways that we do it. Is where we do it using often poles, kind of timber poles that we put into the ground. We use kind of steel that we put into the ground, but we have kind of developed foundation systems where we haven't been allowed to use cement to fix them. Is that we've done it by using ground beams and kind of systems of ground beams. So we've used timber as a substructure, we've used steel as a substructure, and most probably the most light on earth system that we've used is peracle screws. It's a ground screw that you kind of literally bore into the ground, and it kind of gives amazing stability, and then you are able to kind of build a platform on top of that.
And you also told me earlier in another conversation we had that you had built on 7 continents. How does context, or how do you make sure within each context that you work with local materials, or what's the furthest you go to get material?
As I said, before we start our design, is we do this contextual study and site analysis. So I suppose, like most designers, we need to create a story before we start designing. And that story and narrative comes through the context. So we look at the context of the site itself. What is on the site? What materials are on the site? Is it sand? Is it sand? Is it a desert? Is it snow? Is it rock? Is it, we look at contextually what's on the site. We look at it from a historical point of view. We look at what is the history of the area, and within that history, what is the history of architecture? What is the history of construction? And that kind of leads you into what is the vernacular. And then we kind of do a deep dive into the vernacular and look at, kind of what happens and kind of, what is the baseline of vernacular. And I think from that point of view, starts to then lead us to the architectural and material selection that we kind of use on that particular project. And I'll give you an example. It's a project we're busy working on at the moment. It's in Ranthambore, India. And our clients really approached us and contracted us to come in and do a tented camp for them. We went to the site. We kind of really had a good immersive visit to the site. We spent a lot of time on the site. And we walked away to the client. We walked back and we went to the client and we said, we don't think that we should be doing a tented camp on the site. I know that you've employed us, you've contracted us because this is what you want. But we turned around to them and we said, look at the structure on the site. Okay. And it was a very, very simple barn or kind of storeroom structure on the site. It was one of the only structures on this site itself. And what they used to do is that it was made out of stone and locally made mortar. And the stone was literally collected from the fields in the site. And it just had this kind of patina about it, and the way that the stone was kind of hand laid, and it had a level of some mortar with it, but it also had kind of dry packed, kind of elements of dry packed. And it was just the way that it was built was so random because it was just built with what was there. And we said to them, this is the beauty of the site. This is what the site tells us to do. And we managed to convince the client not to kind of do the design as a tented camp, but let us do these kind of stone forms. And we did a whole lot of research into that. And we found that within Ranthambore, within the national park, there are some religious sites that had these overnight huts that pilgrims would go and stay on their way to these shrines. And kind of the architecture that we kind of seen on the site just matched up to these kind of pilgrims, very, very basic pilgrim houses. So that kind of shows you how the kind of context of material that we found on site, plus the kind of historical and kind of historical and social kind of elements come together to drive the design.
That's beautiful. And you said most of your projects, you have to build them in a way that they could be disassembled. Have you ever had to disassemble a project?
We have disassembled projects, and not because. So what is quite interesting, and this comes back to kind of, we've done a lot of work in the Okavango Delta, but sometimes your designs, knowing that the site has a limited lease to it, because there's not the ownership, is you design in a kind of, and for a safari environment, you design for a period of time. So a lot of tented camps have a limited lifespan to them. So we've been in the situation where we've designed a camp. I've had to come back 15 years later, dismantle it, and take it away and start again. It's a crazy experience to do that. Nobody gets a chance to do that again.
And then what do you do with the material? Do you reuse it or?
So what we do is we like to repurpose. So, for instance, we did a lodge in Savuti. It's also in Botswana, and a game reserve called Savuti. And what we did is we repurposed all the timber poles, and we repurposed all the teak decking. So when that was put in the first place, today nobody puts, it's very hard to get African teak that is FSC registered. But we had this kind of old age teak, and we managed to kind of reuse it, and it's absolutely magnificent to use. So we always try and repurpose the materials like that on this. And just kind of a similar story to this is that this lodge called Madwaleni, I was telling you about this Boma, this outdoor restaurant experience that we designed, right? So
the lion
one, right? So here we heard the project that we were doing the lodge for is on a 30,000 hectare reserve that is part of a rewilding program. So the owners have done are an amazing couple who are philanthropists who really believe in bringing kind of nature back. So what they did is they bought a whole lot of farms, old cattle farms, and they knocked down all the fences of these cattle farms. I think they bought about 10 or 15 cattle farms, and they took down all the fences. They went to the local communities of that area who had about another 18,000 hectares, and they took their 12,000 hectares of land that they bought, and I think it was about, I stand to be corrected, but it was about 18,000 hectares of the community, and said, let's create this nature and game reserve, and we will develop it. And they've developed it by kind of removing all the buildings, removing all the cattle out of the land, and repopulating the land again with wild animals. I mean, and that is in itself is not a small undertaking. And I mean, just an amazing project. And they asked us to come and kind of design this lodge for them. This kind of reflects their kind of ideas around sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the projects, the rewilding projects, there is a tree it's actually a tree that grows called black wattle, but it's an invasive species. And it's taken over a lot of the land, and especially around the water courses, the natural rivers. And what it does, it actually sucks all the water and stops natural flow of water. And it's a really invasive species. So they have this eradication program to kind of chop down all these trees from the site. So when I saw and I kind of heard about the program, I said, okay, we need to design something that is a testament to this program. And we know that we were going to do this outdoor Boma restaurant, and that it had to have kind of a fence, almost this fence around it. So when I saw them kind of cutting down these trees, and they had these saplings that were going to be cut down, we then decided, let's use the saplings to be part of the design of this restaurant. But also what we looked at is we looked at what the local community was doing and how they build their houses. And they were building their houses using not these particular saplings, but they use sapling plants to create it's in an area called KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And the local Zulus build these beehive structures. And we decided to start mimicking these beehive structures to an extent that it's a combination of this beehive hut and a basket that is they weave locally from palm. But for us, it was really about the kind of weaving. And so what we did is we got the local, we kind of got the saplings from the program of eradication. We then got the community, the local women from the local community, to kind of take their weaving skills and weave this kind of building for us. And literally, we had this group of women from the local community weave our building for us. And
Wow.
the amazing thing about it is that we've designed for it to fail, right? So it's a natural product. So what happens is that in 3 years' time, from the date that we did it, those saplings are going to disintegrate and kind of fall away. We kept the framework in place as a solid framework, but now the community comes back and weaves it again. And we're taking more saplings from the eradication program. So it's kind of the cycle. So sometimes sustainability is not, sustainability can be like designing something and using a material forever, but it can also be something that is set to fail, to be rebuilt again.
Something four-dimensional that evolves during time.
Exactly.
It's beautiful. Graeme, of all your projects, if I ever want to experience one of those, the best nature experience ever, which project can I not miss?
That is such a hard question to ask me. I can give you 10 of that, but it's not about, as I say to you, it's not about for us, yes, it's about the design, but it is about the experience, okay? And I would say one of the greatest experiences that you can have in your life is to go and trek with the gorillas in either Uganda or Rwanda. And we've done projects in both of these locations. So it's not about the design. You can go and appreciate the design, but to immerse yourself in nature, that is true luxury.
That is a wonderful ending of this amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Graeme. It has been super insightful and very inspiring.
Thank you. And thank you for really kind of inviting me in, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. Graeme, if our listeners want to follow your work and see what you do and book an experience or whatever, where can they find you?
So very easy. Our website is www.luxuryfrontiers-.com. And you can follow us on kind of LinkedIn under Luxury Frontiers, or on Instagram under Luxury Frontiers. And you can also follow me, in terms of kind of the work that kind of I'm doing within the company, under Graeme Labe, LF.
I'll definitely share those links in the description of the episode. Is there anything else you want to share with our listeners?
I think, I've spoken about the experience a lot, but I think, kind of design is a beautiful thing, and kind of used in a positive way. We can make a lot of changes in the world through design and responsible design.
Yeah, conscious design and less is more. I like that. Thank you very much, Graeme.
Thank you so much.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at LadinaShip. Thanks.